Welcome. My name is John Bagnulo. I am excited to be with you today to discuss how more and maybe more importantly, diverse vegetable selection and ultimately the consumption or intake of more families of vegetables can offer, I think, underappreciated benefits to our patients and different populations in some really unique ways. It's a topic that I think we all have interest in, whether it's for our patients or ourselves, and it's one that we may have, I think, had some assumptions around over the last 2 or 3 decades, and so we're going to look at that first. But with that said, for my disclosure, I just want everyone to know that I do serve as Director of Research and Development for Nutritional Medicinals, and as well, I'm a faculty member for IFNA, the Integrative and Functional Nutrition Academy, as well as I co-host a podcast called The Health Edge. So those are my relationships. Now, embarking on this topic and asking important questions that can benefit our patients, and I've always said, like, we should really try to minimize the number of assumptions we make in the area of medicine. I think there's just so much dogma out there, and I think we've all seen great examples of that in different areas, especially recently with things like saturated fat and the lipid theory, total cholesterol theory, et cetera. So here are the 3 important clinical questions that I want us all to ask ourselves. Number 1, are there true clinical benefits to eating more fruits and vegetables? We're going to investigate that here initially. Do specific types of vegetables offer, higher levels of risk reduction or greater levels of protective value to certain areas of our health, maybe organ systems in particular? And then, the clinical aspect of this, as we work with different groups, should we offer better guidance to our patients, with respect to what are the best fruits and vegetables to eat maybe in their unique case? So these are questions that we should be asking ourselves. And, with that being said, I thought, because of our limited time that we have together in this one discussion, I just went back 10 years and I would look at maybe just a handful of studies that have assessed the value of fruit and vegetable consumption, maybe whether that's in the volume of fruits and vegetables, and breaking it down to fruits versus vegetables, looking at them independently, and then looking at different types. So, again, we're just going to go back 10 years. There's plenty of research for us to discuss to get a better sense for the actual research that supports the notion, the recommendation that I think we all offer our patients at times, which is eat more fruits and vegetables, especially eat more vegetables. We know that there can be issues with eating too much fruit, but eating more vegetables, it's a big goal that we have with any population, regardless of their SES group, their level of education, what it is they may be dealing with in terms of a condition or disease. We really want all of our patients to eat more vegetables. So let's take a look at that first. And this 2012 paper in the European Journal of Nutrition showed that if we look at the relationship of vegetable and fruit intake and its influence, that particular dietary pattern's influence on different chronic diseases, that there were probable and possible strengths of evidence with respect to things like COPD, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoporosis, but that really there are only probable relationships for cancer, probable, not deemed at that time in 2012 as convincing. Only there was convincing evidence for hypertension, coronary heart disease, and cerebrovascular accidents or stroke. That was it. So 3 areas with convincing evidence, 1 with probable, and then several with possible. So again, we're just going to look at the last 10 years. Now, a 2017 paper in the International Journal of Epidemiology, and it's a good one, I think that many of you would recognize Giovannucci as a very famous researcher, author that's done a lot of work with researchers like Walter Willett on the Mediterranean diet and food patterns. This paper was interesting because it was going to look at fruit and vegetable intake combined. I apologize for the quality of the slide. I know it's probably difficult to see all of the letters, but it's really examining a linear and a nonlinear relationship between intake patterns and risk for stroke, cancer, cardiovascular disease, as well as all-cause mortality. And if you look at this first slide with respect to fruit and vegetables and stroke incidence, you'll see that the relative risk is generally lower on the top. We're looking at linear relationships there, that the evidence would suggest eating more fruits is protective against stroke. But the nonlinear relationship is where that nonlinear dose response is where things get really interesting, in particular, because with fruit, because you can see that at around 300 or 350, let's say it's halfway between 300 and 400. You could argue it's at 300, but somewhere around 300 grams per day, which is, look, 100 grams of any given fruit is roughly a cup. So, at around 300 grams, 3 cups of fruit per day, you can see in this middle portion of this slide with the nonlinear dose response that there is a slight uptick in that curve, meaning that you're seeing a reduction in benefits and actually a slight increased risk for stroke in comparison to 300 grams, or let's just say 3 cups of fruit. With vegetables, you don't see that. With vegetables, you see that you're still having in that nonlinear dose response. There's still a reduction in risk as you go beyond 300 or even 400 grams of vegetables per day. But when it comes to strokes and the risk for having a stroke, clearly with fruit, more is not necessarily better. And we're going to get into this in a little while and discuss why that might be the case. But collectively, fruits and vegetables, yes. When you look at them collectively, there is both with a linear and a nonlinear dose response, a risk reduction that occurs with higher and higher dietary levels. But when you break those two things apart, it gets interesting. Now, we can look at the relationship here between, in this case, we're looking at coronary heart disease, and you can see that you have both a linear and a nonlinear dose response, risk reduction with increased consumption patterns. So even beyond 300 grams for fruit, still a very modest risk reduction that occurs for every 100 grams of fruit that's consumed. A little stronger with vegetables, but coronary heart disease risk reduction seems to be very consistent. And then for all-cause mortality, things seem to flatten out for the fruit intake pattern, at around 300 grams per day. It's all-cause mortality, things just really flatten out. There's no real slope to that line, in the nonlinear dose response. But with vegetables, it continues to decrease consistently when you go beyond that. So again, a 2017 paper showing that with greater levels of fruits and into an even more significant place with vegetables, there's great protective value here being offered. Now, in a 2018 paper, looking at quartiles, comparing least vegetable consumption levels to the greatest vegetable consumption levels, you can see that there are hazard ratio reductions, but that, again, we don't necessarily have the dose response that we're looking for, meaning that the intermediate vegetable consuming population didn't have a point that fell halfway between the greatest and the least. It was, in some cases, very, very similar or comparable to those that consumed the greatest amount of vegetables. This is looking at all-cause mortality, cardiometabolic disease, which would include diabetes, as well as cardiovascular disease, and specifically coronary heart disease. So again, but it's consistent that there's value to eating more vegetables than, let's say, less. Again, similar analysis with different populations showing that intermediate level of consumption isn't where we'd expect it to be. So this is, again, I'm trying to look at this from a 30,000-foot level and really evaluating the evidence that's there supporting the dietary recommendations or guidance to simply eat more fruits and vegetables. And, I think that you could see there are some areas where a critic of that recommendation could find weaknesses or holes, because in science, for us to say that there is a cause and effect type relationship, it's important to have things such as a mechanism of action, as well as a dose response in place to demonstrate that relationship. Now, in 2021, again, this is in the journal Circulation, which is really focused on cardiovascular disease, cardiovascular health. This is, I think, a great paper looking at different areas of health that are influenced by fruit and vegetable consumption. And again, it will break out fruit consumption, vegetable intake, and you can see that you have different shaped nonlinear curves there. You can, with fruit and vegetable intake, you get total mortality seems to flatten out, somewhere around that servings per day of around, let's say, 6 servings per day. Total mortality for fruit intake seems to flatten out and maybe increases slightly after around 2 servings of fruit per day. So you can look at each of the different, let's just say, chronic diseases with respect to its relationship at different servings of fruits and vegetables. And it's when you get into the respiratory disease, interestingly, for this particular paper, that the respiratory disease really demonstrated the absolute greatest protective relationship, inverse associations, what we call it, meaning that more fruits and vegetables, and overall, when you get to 7 servings per day, that there's still a reduction in that hazard ratio of mortality. So, and neurodegenerative, really not that much. Curve doesn't really move that much. So that's the 2021 paper, again, kind of supporting a benefit there, although a little bit more modest than, let's say, the papers that preceded it. And this is, again, just really looking at fruit and vegetable versus total mortality. And so you can see a sharper uptick there at around 2.5, 3 servings per day for fruit for total mortality in comparison to fruit and vegetable combined. This may have something to do with the fructose content, the added, total sugar burden, glycemic burden, let's say, of some fruit products. But it's, again, that wasn't anything that we're going to come up with as a conclusion from this particular paper, although it was discussed. Now, I'm not sure if you remember this headline from earlier this year. This is from this year, 2022, in February. It was reported across all media outlets that eating vegetables does not protect against cardiovascular disease. And it was, reported as a highly touted large sample size of almost, really, it's closer to half a million UK citizens that were followed over 20 years. And, it was based on self-reporting of vegetable intake. And the authors concluded that there are very, very negligible differences in vegetable intake, raw or cooked, although there was a slight benefit to eating more raw vegetables, almost no benefit to eating cooked vegetables with respect to cardiovascular disease. And the authors concluded that any of the previous associations that were from some of the papers that I've shared with you here, a few moments ago, that those were all due to confounding biases such as level of education, access to health care, a greater likelihood to exercise. That when these researchers controlled for all of those confounding biases, that there was no protective value to eating more vegetables than virtually none. So This, of course, is what we deal with on a regular basis in our field, the field of nutrition and medicine. When this is the headline that is, dispersed widely, for many it is that, well, what do I do with this type of information for a lot of the patients that we work with? So, but that's not the end of the story, and this is only one paper out of many. But I wanted to share it because I think it's important to, again, ask ourselves this question: how much evidence is there? And this would be something that worked in the opposite direction against the assumptions that a lot of us have made. However, later, and not that long after, that 2022 February paper was published, we had the burden of proof study that was in Natural Medicine, and it looked at, and this is again an excellent study to really break down what are some of the benefits of a diet rich in vegetables. And these researchers also controlled for those confounding biases, but found a very different set of results and conclusion, which was that even at 600 grams of vegetables per day, that there was still a reduction in relative risk in comparison to eating 50 grams of vegetables per day. They actually use that as a starting point. So very different findings, and there have been numerous efforts ongoing. If you look at some of the proposals that are there in the way of research to look at this relationship, to really try to get to the bottom of this in different areas. But that's our last 10 years of research centered on whether these are meta-analyses, whether these are 20-year follow-up cohort type studies, to really assess how much fruits and vegetables and levels of fruit and vegetable consumption influence our risk for chronic disease. And I'd say, by and large, most of it has been highly reflective of an inverse relationship, meaning that more fruits and vegetables, generally, at least to a certain point, offers varying levels of protection with at least a few chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, hypertension, possibly certain forms of cancer, diabetes. Those would be the areas or the chronic diseases that have either strong clinical support to at least modest clinical support. Now, what would be the mechanism? Let's now move forward, saying that we have some evidence, maybe we have a significant or a great amount of evidence showing whether that be a dose response or a protective effect. What are the mechanisms where vegetables and fruit, especially the overlapping mechanisms, because we hear so much eat fruits and vegetables, but of course they're very different. They offer different things. So what are the mechanisms whereby fruits and vegetables, or one maybe more so than the other, could offer us this risk reduction? Well, at the top of that list, agreed upon by most researchers, would be potassium and the potassium contributions made by both families or both groups of foods. Then you have specific fiber types because of the influence on the microbiome. Of course, there's polyphenols, which have a wide variety of influence on everything from cytokines to angiogenesis, inflammation, insulin sensitivity. I mean, polyphenols can do so much, as well as feed the microbiome. Then we can get back to another mineral, magnesium. We know magnesium is really important for blood vessel, smooth muscle relaxation. And it has a very favorable effect on blood pressure, reducing hypertensive levels in people. Carotenoid levels, which is a precursor to vitamin A. It has huge influence on gene expression, on immune activity. Then there's trace minerals that are often underappreciated. Trace minerals are those such as selenium, chromium, boron. We know that they have an enormous role on human health. Anti-inflammatory properties. Then there's the potential renal acid load. That has a lot to do with the burden we place on our skeletal system and our renal system to maintain a proper pH of our blood. And then there's the simple notion that eating more vegetables and fruit displaces foods that maybe cause harm, that have high sugar content and have other issues, which put an increased risk on our different areas of health. So these are some of the mechanisms that are well established, whether that be in animal studies or human studies, feeding trials, ranging from in vivo to in vitro. But we know that all of these are potential to more likely, I would say, plausible mechanisms whereby fruit and vegetable intake at higher levels offer protection. Now, I'll start with potassium because I would definitely concur with, the consortium of researchers that feel this is the #1 protective component to fruits and vegetables. And if you look at some of the richest sources of potassium, you can see beet greens are off the charts, 1 cup of beet greens being over 1,300 milligrams of potassium. And we have we have a, adequate intake set forth by, the USDA of around, 3,500 milligrams per day for an adult. Whether that's adequate or not is up for debate. It was previously, 4,300 milligrams. It was reduced recently simply because researchers found that not enough Americans were able to consume that amount of potassium-rich foods per day. And again, that's up for debate because you can see that there are some really, really potassium-rich foods here that if we're eaten on a regular basis, it would become quite feasible to consume over, 4,000 milligrams of potassium per day. But, that being said, 1 cup of beet greens provides over 1/3 of our current adequate intake recommendation. So Swiss chard, spinach, close behind that. All of your truly dark green leafy vegetables are very, very rich sources. And then you get into things like tomatoes, which are an excellent 1 cup of tomatoes, over 400 milligrams. Sweet potatoes are almost 1,000 milligrams. So there's just a wide variety of foods here, of vegetables and fruit, that provide very, very high levels of potassium. But once you leave the vegetable and fruit world, so to speak, the amount of potassium in foods drops off dramatically. And you can see that, for the purpose of this conversation, tuna is here. 4 ounces of tuna is almost 600 milligrams of potassium. That's excellent. And that is true for most fish and seafood. They tend to have, those foods have higher levels of potassium. But, when you get into grains and cereals, and meats and foods like that, they typically do not have the same potassium contents. Dairy products like yogurt can have an excellent potassium content as well. Avocados, of course, being an exceptional source that are not on here, and easily could be at, around 500 milligrams or so for full avocado. Then there's the microbiome influence of whether it's the resistant starch in like root vegetables or it's the fermentable fiber found in other vegetable types. A wide variety of fiber is offered by diverse, families of vegetables and fruit. And we know that to support a healthy microbiome, it's very important, very, very important to have several different types of fiber as well as resistant starch, to support those important commensal families that produce N-butyrate, which has, really important roles in the body for everything from anti-inflammatory properties to brain feeding properties, cardiovascular benefits. So N-butyrate is only going to be produced by gut bacteria when we feed those bacteria the right types of fiber and or resistant starches, which really come from the vegetable and fruit world for the most part. The type of fiber found in whole grains and cereals, often it's lumped in as beneficial fiber, but it's not beneficial to the same extent as the fiber found in vegetables and fruits, especially when it comes to N-butyrate production. Now, under a broader topic of diversity with respect to vegetable and fruit consumption, we fall into a topic known as food synergy, which really revolves around 2 principles. And this is, I think, a fascinating area of nutrition that starts to bring in different disciplines such as botany, ecology. But the principle 1 is ecological arrangement, which is that each whole food, this is really important for us to appreciate, whole foods, any whole vegetable, any whole fruit that still contains the majority of its components, right? The membranes that contain all of the different components of a fruit, the seed, all of the pigments, the organic acids. It's just a wealth of molecules that make up any whole food, especially vegetables and fruits, that compilation of molecules are there to contribute to that plant's health and offer it a much greater chance of surviving in its environment. And many of those benefits, that brings us over to the second principle of this food synergy, when you look at whole foods and what they offer, and that's that the consumption of those foods, it will offer the animal or the human, it'll offer that organism compounds that have potentially synergistic effects that can really improve the health of an organism, as well as, in some cases, molecules that could challenge the health of that. And those would be known as anti-nutrients. So, these two principles are really important to apply when we take a look at different fruits and vegetables and where the benefits, might start to arise with different levels of consumption, and how the processing of fruits and vegetables can radically change the potential for that particular food to help us. So we'll look at that in a moment. But I first want to just help everyone identify some different families of vegetables here. We have the dark green leafy vegetables, which would be examples of things such as spinach, Swiss chard, beet greens, as well as, there's some overlap here, certain brassicas like bok choy, arugula, as well as some lesser appreciated and underutilized vegetables, things like dandelion greens, chicory, escarole. These would all fall under the dark green leafy family of vegetables, and they're all extremely high in potassium, as we talked about a moment ago. And because of that potassium content, as well as high magnesium levels, all of these foods have negative PRAL values. That's a potential renal acid load, which I mentioned earlier. And really, the lower the PRAL, the more of these typically bone-building minerals are contributed by a vegetable. So they're all very valuable. And that's one family of vegetables. Then you have your starchy root vegetables, which are, in addition to being high in potassium, things like sweet potatoes and beets and even white potatoes, they're also high in resistant starch, and many of them offer us carotenoids. The allium sulfide family, which would be the onion, garlic, leek, scallion family, those have strong anti-inflammatory properties. They also, contain a variety of different polyphenols, phytonutrients, and they have, for the most part, significant prebiotic value. So they can really feed important families of gut bacteria. Then there's the peas and the legume family, which are high in L-arginine, high in fiber, and many of these contain significant amounts of B vitamins, folate in particular, as well as choline, which is an important B vitamin-like molecule that's necessary for detoxification and to make toxins that are typically fat soluble, to make them water soluble in the liver. So, that family is technically a family of vegetables. Then there's the cruciferous family, or the brassica family, which I think often get the headlines with respect to things like risk reduction in the way of cancer, breast cancer in particular, as well as, being known for other benefits in the area of cardiovascular health. But the brassicas are your bok choy, your cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, bok choy, broccoli rabe or rapini, that family, which is really an enormous family of vegetables. But in addition to that, many of the brassicas, such as mustard greens, collard greens, arugula, which we'll look at a little later on, are very high in potassium nitrate. And that's a unique form of potassium that really favors blood vessel dilation. And of course, they're all good sources of fiber. So they feed, they feed the microbiome in a very beneficial way. And then there's the umbelliferae family, which probably is less familiar to many of you. In that family, things like asparagus, carrots to an extent, the tops of the carrots, but any vegetable that has, the fine kind of umbrella, feather-like canopy, asparagus is the one that most people can identify with. Those are really good sources of glutathione, as well as, very unique and beneficial prebiotic fibers. So here's just a few groups of vegetables that I think, demonstrate a wide variety of micro and macronutrients that are offered to whoever consumes them. Now, when we look at, fruits and vegetables, I think it's good to look at them in an analytical way, a cost benefit ratio, so to speak. And, you get potential physiological cost with fruits and vegetables. Typically it's limited to the fructose content, potential allergens, and then anti-nutrients. An example of an anti-nutrient would be, let's say, the goitrogens that are in certain brassicas. That's why brassicas should always be cooked thoroughly. For the most part, there are some exceptions. Arugula, for instance, is a small brassica that can be eaten raw because it has such a low goitrogen content. But, cabbage, for instance, eating large amounts of raw cabbage, large amounts of raw broccoli, I think that it can be contraindicated when you take a look at the potential for those vegetables and their goitrogen contents to, maybe, cause issues with thyroid function, thyroid health, because of the way goitrogens interact and influence iodine metabolism. But that would be an example of an anti-nutrient found in a vegetable, where you'd have to eat, large amounts of raw brassicas in specific types of brassicas to ever really run into this kind of, potential physiological cost. Fructose is the most common one, and I think that's why I show bananas here on this slide, because bananas are, a fruit, and I know that it's convenient for folks to eat bananas. I know that we hear good things about them in the way of their potassium content, but in the, grand scheme of things, bananas probably offer us the least benefit in comparison to other fruits and vegetables on a totality type of approach, because they're high in fructose. There's around 11 grams of fructose in a banana. There's a modest amount of potassium, not a lot, and that's about it. So yeah, there's a little bit of resistant starch if it's a green banana, but it's just doesn't have the kind of upside that many fruits do and most vegetables do. So that would be something that I think would really give us a clear idea of how you can look at the certain fruit and vegetable choices with a better idea of how much they can benefit a person or a population. And the potential benefit, as we've already discussed, range from the potassium fiber, down to the water content and all the different things that fall in between. Obviously, phytonutrients are valuable, but they vary with such wide variation from vegetable to vegetable. But this is how we should really start to think about fruit and vegetable guidance for our populations that we work with, helping people make better choices that will fit their particular physiological needs, as well as their taste preferences, their familiarity and ability to cook, and use some of the vegetables that we're going to talk about in a moment. But I think it's always important to step back and look at things on this kind of cost benefit analysis. And then the other important principle that I would be remiss if I didn't cover is, our efforts to make supplements or medications out of fruits and vegetables. It has failed repeatedly and consistently over the last 30 or 40 years. The beta carotene studies are, I think, really so valuable in teaching this. We have the carrot study. We have the ATBC study, which was done here in the United States. The carrot study took place over in Europe. Basically looked at beta carotene supplement use in comparison to placebo. And what's been demonstrated now on 3 different occasions is that lung cancer incidence actually rises with the use of beta carotene supplements in comparison to a placebo, simply because beta carotene, when taken alone, binds onto the P53 gene and prevents its expression, thereby preventing apoptosis of cancerous cells. So we always want to have apoptosis available to cells which have mutations, so that they self-destruct and don't lead to the development of neoplasms or cancer. But taking beta carotene supplements alone in the type of dosages that were involved in these 2 studies, as well as other ones, shows that it's really should be contraindicated when it comes to cancer in groups who are at greater risk of cancer. So this is not true with eating beta carotene rich foods, which is what I really want to show here, which is that you get high levels of protection against lung cancer with the consumption of even orange and yellow fruits and vegetables. And that's simply because there is an orchestra of carotenoids and other phytonutrients that occur in any whole vegetable and any whole fruit, and they work synergistically together. So there would be competition for, in the case of this beta carotene example, there would be competition for that p53 binding site, and beta carotene would not be allowed to be the only player in that example of epigenetics. And so other carotenoids could bind in, let's just say, DNA sites that were in close proximity to that p53 gene and prevent it from being masked by beta carotene. So it's a healthy check and balance system that is provided by eating whole fruits and vegetables, and that is lost when we take one particular nutrient out of a fruit or vegetable and expect it to function the same way in terms of favorable health. It doesn't work that way. We've seen it with vitamin E being taken out of nuts and seeds. You really serious questions should be asked around taking vitamin E supplements in an effort to produce any type of favorable health benefit, when you see that there's an increased risk for things such as myocardial infarctions in comparison to the placebo. But yet you can see that healthy nut and seed consumption is associated with a reduction in both heart disease, stroke, as well as type 2 diabetes. So it's not to say that the sources of vitamin E are an issue. It's that when we take a particular vitamin or a nutrient like beta carotene out of a food, it doesn't operate the same way. So we have a limited appreciation for the synergistic functional properties that are found in whole foods, and I think this is really demonstrated by vegetables and fruit consumption. And I think the questions we should ask ourselves in our efforts to value fruits and vegetables are we too heavily influenced by the macronutrients of foods, like let's say the calories and fats that are contributed by an avocado. Do we let those macro values deter us from eating more of a food such as an avocado? On the micronutrient side of things, would it be better for us to evaluate a food's influence on our health by using something like a potential renal acid load value, or looking at how certain fruits and vegetables in particular influence our hemodynamics or the inflammatory cascade? I think this is the area we have to go really to get a better understanding and a better appreciation for how fruits and vegetables in particular can help our patients and can help different populations. So with that being said, I want to highlight some very important fruits and vegetables for you to consider encouraging your patients to eat more of, for you to maybe consider weaving more of these into your own personal diet. And I think that a lot of these will be familiar, but will be often underutilized or underconsumed. And I'm going to start out with arugula. As I mentioned earlier, arugula is a fascinating member of the brassica family. It has a very distinct flavor that I think most people are familiar with. Some people really don't like the flavor. And in that case, arugula is not for you, and that's okay. There's other choices that are just as beneficial overall, but arugula is one that's widely available now. That wasn't the case 30 years ago. Arugula now does have a much larger following in terms of people that like to use it in salads, but I want to encourage you to use it in areas other than salads. For instance, smoothies. Arugula is great in a smoothie. And the reason that I'm so big on arugula and that people should consider it more for their patients is it's the single best source of potassium nitrate. And potassium nitrate is used by the body to generate nitric oxide readily. That actually starts in the mouth when we chew arugula. Microbes in the mouth really start to drive that reaction and get that potassium nitrate to a place of nitric oxide, which will dilate blood vessels and have a very, very significant influence on circulation. So this is one of the top foods for that, for improving circulation in that area of our hemodynamic regulation. In addition, arugula is a great source of magnesium, as are most dark greens. It's a member of the brassica family. It doesn't contain the goitrogens that are found in your larger members of that family, so that's why it's okay to eat it raw. But yet it does have sulforaphane, which is great for as a phytonutrient, helping with estrogen, healthy estrogen metabolism, particularly in women that are concerned with estrogen positive breast cancer. So a lot of really good things about arugula, and I encourage people to make more of their salads and smoothies out of that. Now, I want to just cover a couple fruits that I think, when I go back to that cost benefit ratio that I mentioned, a couple fruits that really stand out, which means that they have really, great attributes with very low levels of fructose. And the blueberry is one of the best examples of that. And I think most people are at least familiar with blueberry in terms of its antioxidant value. But there are other polyphenols that are found, outside of the anthocyanins, which have been shown to improve the microbiome profile of populations in clinical studies, both in animal and human trials. We know that blueberries, as a member of the vaccinium family of fruits, tends to have high polyphenol content, and specifically polyphenols that feed and foster a healthy microbiome. So a lot of really good things about some fruits. And technically, winter squash, that's what this is. Winter squash is technically a fruit. A lot of us, refer to it as a vegetable, and I think it's good at this time of year here as we, approach Thanksgiving in particular, to look at some members of that squash and pumpkin family a little differently. These are really great staple foods that we should encourage people to eat more of. Much is the same with sweet potatoes and different varieties of white potato. They're great sources of potassium. In addition to that, having that potassium, which we know favors healthy blood pressure, winter squash, pumpkin, great sources of citrulline. Now, citrulline is like an amino acid. It is very similar to L-arginine in the fact that it favors nitric oxide production, just like we talked about with arugula. And this production of nitric oxide, again, helps lower blood pressure independently of some of the other facets of control that we have over that. So winter squash gets a great source of resistant starch and other types of fiber that feed the microbiome. It has one of the lowest potential renal acid load values, so it's excellent for populations interested in improving their bone density or skeletal health. And look, the take-home message here for these starchy vegetables and or fruits, in the case of the Circubita family, pumpkin, winter squash, when you get into starchy root vegetables and this family of vegetables, this is where we should be encouraging our patients to get their carbohydrates from. More from vegetables and fruits like this, and less from breads, cereals, pasta, and all of the really carbohydrate dense, low nutrient density bread and flour products. They don't really serve the populations that we want to work for. They don't serve them as well. This is a great staple food that can be used in so many different ways. Pumpkin and squash chunks can be put into any type of soup or stew, much like we do with carrots. They can be roasted or baked and then scooped out and eaten that way with cinnamon. They can also be, after they've been either steamed or roasted, they can be put in a blender to bring sweetness and body to a smoothie. I just can't say enough about this family and how underutilized they are. And look, for a lot of the populations that we work with, some of the underserved populations that are really challenged to find affordable fruits and vegetables, winter squash and pumpkin are very affordable, and it's easy to teach people how to use them quickly and efficiently in their kitchens. So I think that this is just such a great food on so many levels. Now, leeks. Leeks are an example of a vegetable. They're a member of the allium sulfide family that have, things like quercetin and allicin in them, which we know are great for detoxification. Just do so many different things for our blood on a hemodynamic level. They can essentially thin the blood and help reduce clot formation. They also prevent angiogenesis, which we know is important as dietary quality for cancer patients that are maybe undergoing treatment in other ways, anti-inflammatory. But I've talked to so many researchers in the area of microbiome health, and I would say, 80% of the researchers that I've had conversations with around the microbiome have said in their trials and what they've observed, no food matches the leek in terms of how it can favor the growth of beneficial, really important families of bacteria in the microbiome. So leeks are, again, underutilized, right? I mean, people use onions, people use garlic, but people tend not to cook with or utilize leeks the same way, and they're very easy to cook with. Again, they can be put into soups and stir fries and even salads, as long as they're, you just want to wash the dirt that can sometimes accumulate at the base of those long leaves. But after leeks are washed out, they can be eaten raw or cooked a lot of different ways. And I encourage people to shop for leeks regularly, have them at least a few times a week. Cranberries, another example of an amazing fruit with almost no fructose and so much in the way of organic acid value. Quinic acid is one that's really well known. Quinic acid and hippuric acid both have been shown to have such protective value against urinary tract infections and other infections in the body. And I think cranberries are a great ingredient to put into, and again, it's timely, right? I mean, we're talking about these foods, as Thanksgiving approaches. And I think that the important thing to do is to take some of the attraction that maybe our patients will get eating some of these foods around Thanksgiving, and encourage them not to limit their consumption to only at the holiday, but to get them eating cranberries and leeks and winter squash and pumpkins year round. They have so much value. It's a shame that they're limited to, the 1 or 2 times a year that people enjoy them typically on a holiday. Again, this family, that in cranberries are a member of the Vaccinium family, much like blueberries are and bilberries and all of those small berries that are on bushes. They have very high ORAC scores, an incredible amount of antioxidant value and an ability to neutralize free radicals. The polyphenols that are in cranberries feed Akkermansia mucinophilia, one of the most important microbes to have in the gut, more so than any other food studied. And so whether you're trying to reduce, infection that, may be translocating in the body from one system to the next, which is often important for the critically ill, or you're trying to foster a healthy microbiome, look, cranberries are hard to beat. And so this is an example of a really high-end, high-value fruit that's at the opposite end of the spectrum as, let's say, a banana or something else that's high in fructose. Beets are, again, some people just have never had beets prepared the right way. And that's why some people don't have the, the affinity or the taste for beets. But beets can be put into a smoothie really easily to bring some sweetness to that without any fructose. Beets are predominantly glucose-based and a great source of beta-D-glucan, which binds onto bile. And look, it's important to understand that one of the primary methods of eliminating toxins from the body is through our bile. And so binding bile in the gut and then eliminating that bile from the body is how we really break what we call the recycling of toxins in the body. If we don't bind on to bile acids, they for the most part get recycled or reabsorbed in the large intestine. They go right back to the liver. So the key to eliminating toxins is to break that recycling process of bile and to eliminate it. And beets are one of the best foods to do that because of their beta-D-glucan content. So they're phenomenal for that. They're a great source of potassium nitrate. They help form nitric oxide. That's why beet juice is, renowned amongst athletes for improving circulation. There's some great trials that have been done at places like Ohio State showing that, ingesting 100 grams of beets or even beet juice prior to an athletic event or a bout of training can greatly improve circulation and can improve performance. And a lot of that is, again, just generating nitric oxide from that potassium nitrate that's found in both beets and in beet greens. Great source of fiber and a great source of the purple, dark red anthocyanin contributing pigment. Hey, and lastly, the purple sweet potato. All sweet potatoes are great, but the purple sweet potato is really a standout. Again, that purple color is always associated with a high ORAC value. Purple sweet potatoes, I mean, like they're delicious. For most people that try them, as is the case with sweet potatoes in general, it's easy to make them into a dessert, whether that's by adding cinnamon or cutting them into longer slices and making fries with them. There's so much you can do with sweet potatoes. But purple sweet potatoes have over 80 papers that have been published, either in the way of feeding studies with animals, human trials. Just there's so much research around purple sweet potatoes because of how and what has been observed in both animal and in human populations when they have been used at 5% of the diet, let's say. Low in fructose, high in resistant starch, overall just a well-rounded array of micro and macronutrients. And I would argue that if you were left on an island and you really only had one plant food that you were going to survive on for an extended period of time, it would be really tough to beat the sweet potato. And I think the purple sweet potato would be the absolute best possible plant food that you could live almost indefinitely on because of how complete it is in so many ways. Now, I'm going to just, in closing here, just highlight a couple of areas that there is really, I think, a considerable amount of clinical evidence showing distinct benefits to a certain family of vegetables and or more that really offer distinct benefits. And one of those is improved GI function, a better gastrointestinal environment, better microbiome, and that's with respect to the brassica family, which we've spent a good amount of time talking about. This is a great paper, 2017 paper, that looked at how the regular consumption of a diet rich in brassicas reduced the abundance of what we call sulfur or sulfate reducing bacteria. And you really are trying to avoid having an abundance of bacteria such as Desulvo vibrio. That bacteria in particular cannibalizes all the sulfur that we need for our body. Sulfur is an important aspect of so much of our body. We need sulfur for detoxification reactions. We need sulfur to produce sulfated anions, and the list goes on and on. So if we have a gut full of sulfate reducing bacteria, we end up being shortchanged with the amount of sulfur that we need for physiological purposes. So we want to reduce these sulfur consuming bacteria, and a diet high in brassicas has been shown to do that. And you can see here that a high versus a low brassica diet resulted in very significant differences in those sulfate reducing bacteria. So again, more brassicas, again, you want them to be well cooked because we're trying to minimize that goitrogen exposure, at least with some of them. But more brassica is very beneficial with respect to the GI environment and the microbiome in particular. Insulin resistance, these are some top level risk reducers for women. To the greatest risk reduction was achieved with higher levels of allium sulfide. Again, that's the garlic, leek, scallion, onion family. Higher levels of those, particularly raw, produce the greatest risk reduction in women for insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. And for men, it was the orange and red vegetables and fruits, and most notably carrots, tomatoes, and to a lesser extent, sweet potatoes and pumpkins. So those were the vegetables that were demonstrated the greatest level of risk reduction for men in type 2 diabetes. So some standouts there. All right, trying to bring this home here, just for the sake of our time together. Clinical considerations that summarize, this discussion. Increase diversity of vegetable families daily, and really encourage the inclusion of vegetables at all meals. Eggs combined with vegetables, for breakfast, getting vegetables into a smoothie as part of a breakfast drink. Whenever possible, weave vegetables into all meals. Specific vegetables may offer greater total mineral content that could, for instance, help patients that have hypertension or greater risk for cardiovascular disease, but also specific vegetables such as the brassicas for women who have a family history of estrogen positive breast cancer. Recommending specific vegetables who have elevated liver enzymes and really need help with detoxification. There's a way to tailor these specific vegetable families, greater levels of them, for populations or for patients who have unique physiological needs. Recommend vegetables as a primary source of carbohydrates over foods that have less in the way of micronutrients and don't have these wonderful polyphenols and organic acids. So, really recommend things like winter squash and sweet potatoes and white potatoes. Recommend those as primary sources of carbohydrate over breads and pastas and all of the flour-based foods. And lastly, and this might be one of the most important recommendations because we have to allow our patients and the populations we work with to find ways to consume them, encourage one-pot cooking and simple recipes for soups and stews or smoothies, ways to drink these amazing vegetables and fruits. And I think if we do these things, we'll be serving the populations that we work with in a more effective fashion. And so with that, I want to leave you with, I think, an image that's worth a lot in terms of what's possible. Use a blender whenever you can, or you find that time for the people that you're working with, when time is a big barrier, use the blender. And with that, I want to say eat, experiment, and be well. And have a happy Thanksgiving.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bagnulo. Just a few questions here. The first one is, for the first section of the webinar, when you were presenting a lot of the research, was that research focused primarily on fresh fruits and vegetables, or did some of that data also look at frozen, canned, and dried?
Yeah, that's a great question. Fresh included the frozen varieties. It did not include canned, but it was including cooked, a variety of cooking methods that ranged from boiled, steamed, sauteed, but using both fresh and frozen, not canned though.
Okay, thank you. Can you comment on the use of pure monk fruit as a sweetener, if there are any positive or negative consequences as it relates to today's discussion?
Yeah, sure. I have really limited information. I would say I'm not aware of any negative influence of using monk fruit. I've not seen any positive effects on human health or in any studies, but most people are concerned with these sweeteners. Are there any negative findings? There haven't been any with stevia or monk fruit for that matter.
Okay. Is there a difference in antioxidant content in commercial produce versus organic?
Yeah, there are. The University of California at Davis, UC Davis, has conducted research. They're one of the centers that's looked at this most closely. It's been published in the Journal of Agriculture and Food Chemistry, which has shown that organically grown fruits and vegetables, and they highlighted several, the tomatoes would be an example of one, had higher polyphenol contents than those which were grown conventionally. And it's easy to understand the mechanism behind this. This isn't an effort to just glorify organic vegetables. It's really simple. If you apply pesticides, fungicides, and or herbicides to any crop, thereby you reduce the effort of that plant to defend itself against those particular environmental pressures. And that's really what most polyphenols do for plants. They protect the plant against anything from ultraviolet light to a particular type of pest or fungus that's in that environment. So when we artificially control for those pests, then the plant no longer has the stimulus needed to produce some of these beneficial substances. There's that model. The other model is that glyphosate disrupts the shikimate pathway, and it prevents plants from taking the aromatic amino acids such as tyrosine and phenylalanine and to use those to form polyphenols. Again, polyphenols are multi-ring structures, and at the center of those, in the formation of those, it requires these aromatic amino acids, and that's really how glyphosate works as an herbicide. It prevents plants from forming these polyphenols from those specific amino acids. So we, again, it's easy to see why there would be a reduction in polyphenols in non-organic fruits and vegetables that may have had glyphosate in their soil or their environment. So there's a lot of different mechanisms, but to answer that, yes, there have been papers, and those are available. Again, Journal of Agricultural and Food Chemistry is one journal that I found several papers that have shown this.
Okay, thank you. What are your thoughts on beetroot powder?
I think it can be excellent. I think it's important that the beetroot powder be whole, minimally processed, from freeze-dried beets. And I think it could be a great addition to a person's, overall daily regimen.
Awesome. And this will be our last question, just to be cognizant of time. What vegetable family did you say was associated with helping with elevated liver enzymes?
Elevated liver enzymes, again, can occur due to a variety of situations, from polypharmacy, it's too many medications that kind of overwhelm that cytochrome P450 series of detoxification enzymes, and elevated liver enzymes can occur when there's, abundance of fatty liver deposits. But by and large, beets and beet greens would be one of the top foods that I would recommend for liver health. And then the family of vegetables that can be very beneficial would be that allium sulfide family, which are, again, leeks, onions, garlic, scallions, that family.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Bagnulo. Really appreciate your time and your knowledge. To everyone that attended, we will be sending out your continuing professional education certificates by the end of the day on Friday. So please, if you don't receive it by Friday, let us know. We will also include all the references in that email. The recording of this webinar will be available within the next 1 to 2 weeks on our website also. So you'll get an email when that recording is available. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but we appreciate you, and everybody have a wonderful holiday.